Hi, my name is Christina Cushy, and I'll be presenting on the importance of medical device security and education in healthcare organizations. One thing often taken for granted is the network security of implantable medical devices, or IMDs for short, that are Bluetooth or Wi-Fi capable, as they can be easily compromised. Even large IT departments overlook protecting medical devices in the same manner as the organization's overall network. Security attacks on medical devices have some pretty extreme consequences, like operating in a life-threatening manner. Per FDA standards, medical device manufacturers have not had to consider intentional or unintentional compromise of a device based on cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Therefore, those risks have not been considered as part of a product's design. To ensure the future protection of medical devices in a wired, or shall we say wireless world, a coordinated, proactive approach that includes standard cybersecurity assessment and control, coupled with specific medical device data and workflow considerations, is needed. Awareness of cybersecurity vulnerabilities in medical devices needs to be enhanced, and the only way to do that is through a proper education program and public outreach. Most healthcare leaders are not well educated in the realm of medical device security. The high risk of hacking should make educating those leaders a top priority. The term hack came long before computers. It actually originated in the 1960s with the MIT Railroad Club, who would hack high-tech train sets to modify their functions. Next in the 70s came phreakers, which were hackers of phones and the telephone switching network that had just gone electronic. Then, of course, in the 80s came computers, which led to a new malicious breed of hackers. Laws were created from the chaos that ensued in the 80s. However, the 90s brought even more cybercrime, giving hackers a more proper title: crackers. Kevin Mitnick, a consultant, Kevin Poulsen, who's the editor for Wired and Black Hat Hacker, Robert Morris, who created the Morris Worm in 1988, and Vladimir Levin, who hacked Citibank and got $10 million, were some very high-profile arrests made in regards to cybercrime. A hacker is the good guy, whereas a cracker is the bad guy. I'll give you a good scenario to explain the difference. Let's say your front door is unlocked and nobody is home. A hacker will notice the door is unlocked and might go in just to look around, but will lock the door when they leave and also leave the owners a note that their door was unlocked. A cracker, on the other hand, will notice the door unlocked, will definitely enter, they'll break and destroy things, scatter your belongings all over the place, leave the door unlocked, then go tell all their friends how to get in. In 2008, researchers tested a 2003 pacemaker. The findings? Someone using low-cost homemade equipment could wirelessly communicate with the device to modify settings, cause a large shock, and learn private information about the patient. In November 2007, and again in March 2008, a group of crackers compromised an epilepsy support website by posting animated images that caused photosensitive epilepsy patients to experience pain and seizures. Wireless Sensor Network, or WSN, is a wireless network consisting of spatially distributed autonomous devices using sensors to monitor physical or environmental conditions, which we will discuss later in the presentation. There is no one-size-fits-all fix when it comes to securing medical devices. No single security method or mechanism could provide sufficient security for every device under every circumstance. But that does not mean the attempt should not be there, nor does it mean that education of the potential threats and possible fixes should be brushed aside. I'm going to discuss a few more devices: insulin pumps and automatic external defibrillators, or AEDs. In 2005, there were approximately 245,000 insulin pump users in the United States, and that rate was expected to grow at a compound rate of 9% from 2009 to 2016. Computer-related failures are reported to the FDA, but security-related failures are not. Researchers tested an insulin pump that is still on the market. Equipped with only the user's manual and publicly available information, like specs of the radio chip, they were able to eavesdrop on the wireless communication by using off-the-shelf hardware and a publicly available software radio platform. Upon using reverse engineering on the communication protocol and packet format, they were also able to discover the pump's pin, which is what controls the remote and the glucose meter. They then spoofed a data packet the pump accepted, which contained misleading information like an incorrect glucose level, which in turn gave the command for the wrong dosage of insulin to be administered. To accomplish this, they needed to know the frequency of the pump, which is also publicly available online and easily obtained through its FCC ID. Possible defenses could be to employ the use of rolling code-based encryption, which is the same technology used in remote entry systems on automobiles. This viable defense makes it impossible to extract that PIN. Or they could employ cryptography in the communication protocol, something other than regular cryptographic algorithms, because regular cryptographic algorithms are too heavyweight for most medical devices. Researchers got their hands on an AED called the Cardiac Science G3 Plus AED Model 9390A, which has been in production since 2005 and has Windows-based utilities for updating and configuring. They used this device to perform a software security analysis and discovered 4 vulnerabilities, which are buffer overflow, weak password authentication scheme, credentials stored in plain text, and improper use of CRC as digital signature. Buffer overflow is an anomaly where a program, while writing data to a buffer, overflows the buffer's boundary and overwrites adjacent memory locations. The AED update sends a packet over the COM port to the AED and then receives a response. The analysts spoofed packets coming from the COM port and were able to control the data that AED update received from the device, essentially triggering the vulnerability and achieving arbitrary code execution. This vulnerability was discovered through manual analysis. However, it was later verified that entry points obtained through reverse engineering were discovered in mere minutes using a vulnerability tool called Bitfuzz. Weak password authentication scheme was discovered during reverse engineering. The password file for the AED is stored on the local hard drive, so anyone with privileges can delete it in order to circumvent protection mechanisms. By using a simple XOR scheme, authentication was achieved along with recovering, then changing the user's password. Credentials stored in plain text were discovered while examining AED update, which showed files being uploaded to a remote FTP server. When analysts investigated further, they discovered that the address of the FTP server, username, and password were stored in plain text within the update software. Private user information is collected when a firmware upgrade is started and includes contact information, serial number, and the firmware version, which are all available to anyone who accesses the login credentials. Improper use of weak cyclic redundancy check, also known as CRC as digital signature, was discovered at the start of the software update. As the software begins its update, it sends a CRC value of the new firmware. Once transferred, the device calculates the CRC of the received firmware and allows the current firmware to be replaced if and only if they match. This was circumvented by extracting the code responsible for CRC calculation and verification and then generating a new CRC to convince the AED that the new code was legitimate, which worked. This vulnerability allows malicious modifications that could lead to device failure and patient harm. Unfortunately, software security remains an afterthought for medical devices design. Manufacturers of medical devices containing software should have plans for assessing specific security risks, especially if the manufacturer intends on using wireless communication, as this only greatly increases the device's exposure to the risks of malicious software. It is also duly important for healthcare organizations and healthcare leaders to educate themselves on these potential risks with life-saving devices being placed into their patients. Wireless Sensor Network, or WSN. A WSN system incorporates a gateway that provides wireless connectivity back to the wired world in distributed nodes. Wireless communication ranges are not confined, so they can be easily attacked on their way back to the server. Testing has shown that it is fairly easy to flood a device with so much inappropriate communication traffic that normal communication fails to reach the device, or it can prematurely drain the batteries, greatly reducing the device's intended lifespan. WSN is susceptible to 4 different attacks. They are selective forwarding, sinkhole threat, Sybil attack, and denial of service attack. Selective forwarding pertains to an attack on the nodes which can be told not to forward certain messages to the server. Using a heart monitoring device as an example, the data is collected and sent through the WSN to the doctor or nurse monitoring that patient from their workstation. When the messages are manipulated or selectively not being sent, it can appear that the patient is fine, when in reality the patient is in full cardiac arrest. A sinkhole threat is when an attacker tries to all neighboring nodes to establish routes through a malicious node. Once the attacker is successful in the sinkhole attack, it opens the network for further attacks, like eavesdropping or selective forwarding. Furthermore, sinkhole attacks are extremely hard to detect. Sybil attack is an already compromised node that presents multiple fake identities to other neighboring nodes in the network. The Sybil attack poses a significant threat in geographic and multipath routing protocols because the compromised node may appear in more than one place. The Sybil attack opens the door for other routing attacks like sleep attacks or wormhole attacks. The 3 previous attacks I just mentioned were attacks on the routing of information through the network. Denial of service attack disrupts the entire system by destroying resources on the device. Denial of service attack is essentially a complete failure of the device by way of sending extra unnecessary packets of information which prevents legitimate network users from accessing services or resources. This type of attack is not just meant to subvert, disrupt, or destroy a network, but also diminishes the entire network that provides a service. Most of the attacks against security in wireless sensor networks are caused by the insertion of false information by the compromised nodes within the network, which would require something that would detect false reports. Developing such a detection mechanism and make it inefficient represents a huge research challenge. The cybersecurity threats to medical devices is a multifaceted issue that must be viewed from a systemic perspective if adequate protection is to be put in place and patient safety concerns addressed. It will undoubtedly require technical controls, governance, resilience measures, consolidated reporting, context expertise, regulation, and standards. A coordinated, proactive approach would be the best course of action to address this complex issue. The contention between medical device manufacturers and regulation has been an ongoing issue because rigorous clinical trials are not part of the process for approval of all devices and is actually handled through pre-market submission and post-market surveillance. It is important to point out that compliance with regulation does not equal security. Compliance is merely regulation or policy based off static principles. Meanwhile, security addresses a dynamic and uncertain environment that is difficult to predict, manage, and define for compliance. The future of healthcare will look much differently once the security of medical devices becomes a top priority and can easily create a new job market in medical device cybersecurity. The biggest challenge is going to be closing the gap between cybersecurity requirements and patient safety. Medical devices are an integral part of medical networks, so the security of the device should be as well. This will require increased collaboration between medical physicists and IT professionals, medical device manufacturers, and network vendors, as well as taking some input from cybersecurity experts, better known as hackers. To ensure the future protection of medical devices in a wired, or shall we say wireless world, a coordinated, proactive approach that includes standard cybersecurity assessment and control coupled with specific medical device data and workflow considerations is needed. Awareness of cybersecurity vulnerabilities in medical devices needs to be enhanced, and the only way to do that is through a proper education program and public outreach. These are all the references I used for my project. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.